Welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy this story. Please consider liking the video and subscribing for more content like this. Your support means the world. And now, let's begin. The sun beat down on Jedediah Stone's cracked leather hat, a relentless hammer in the desolate expanse of the Arizona Territory. Grit coated his tongue, and his horse, Bess, plodded with a weariness that mirrored his own. He wasn't a cattleman, not by choice anyway, but old Henderson had paid him up front to find the stray steer, and Jed needed the coin. His past as a cavalry scout felt a lifetime away, a life of sharper edges and clearer enemies. Now, it was just survival, one dusty job to the next. He crested a low rise, eye-scanning the broken land. That's when he saw the buzzard circling lazy black commas against the bleached blue sky. His hand instinctively went to the Colt Peacemaker holstered on his hip. Trouble had a smell, and this place reeked of it. He nudged Bess forward, slowly, his gaze sweeping the rocks and thorny scrub. The signs were fresh, scuffed earth, a broken arrow shaft, the patchy, by the fletching, and then, darker stains soaking into the parched ground. A skirmish, and a recent one. He dismounted, tying Bess to a stunted mesquite, and drew his Winchester from its scabbard. Moving with the practiced silence of his former profession, he tracked the disturbance towards a jumble of sandstone boulders. He found the first body half hidden in the shade, a warrior from a local band, face contorted in a final rictus. Then another. This hadn't been a clean fight. He rounded a large, sun-baked rock and froze. A girl, no older than 16, huddled against the stone. Her dark eyes, wide with terror, fixed on him. She wore a simple doeskin dress, torn at the shoulder, revealing a crude, blooded bandage. She was native, clearly, but not dressed like the warriors he'd found. When she saw him, saw the rifle in his hands and the pallor of his skin, a sound escaped her, a choked whimper. She pressed herself further into the rock, as if trying to merge with it. Her hand, small and trembling, clutched a smooth, grey stone, her only apparent weapon. She expected death. Jed could see it in the defiant terror that stiffened her slight frame. He'd seen that look before, too many times. He lowered the Winchester slightly, a gesture he hoped conveyed a lack of immediate threat, though he doubted it registered past her fear. His mind, pragmatic and quick, assessed the situation. Alone, wounded, surrounded by the dead of her own people. Abandoned, or the sole survivor. Either way, she was in a bad spot. And now, so was he. He didn't need this complication. He just wanted the damned steer. Jed kept his movement slow, deliberate. He knew that any sudden action could send the girl into a panic, or worse, make her try something desperate. Her eyes, like a cornered animal's, never left him. He could see the pulse beating frantically in her throat. "Easy now," he said, his voice raspy from dust and disuse. The words were for his own benefit as much as hers, she likely didn't understand him. He pointed to the bloody makeshift bandage on her arm. "That looks bad." He took a cautious step closer. She flinched, her knuckles white around the stone she clutched. He stopped. This was going nowhere fast. He needed to tend to that wound, or infection would take her before anything else did. He thought of the small medical kit in his saddlebags, carbolic, clean linen, things a man alone in the territories learned to carry. He gestured towards his horse, then back to her arm, trying to convey his intent. She just stared, her fear a palpable wall between them. The sun was starting to dip, painting the rocks in hues of orange and purple. The temperature would plummet soon. Leaving her here was a death sentence, whether from her injuries, the cold, or whatever had caused this carnage in the first place. He sighed, a gust of dusty air. His cynical side, the one honed by years of hardship and betrayal, told him to ride on, to not get involved. She wasn't his problem. But then he saw the faint tremor in her hands, the sheen of fever already in her eyes. He remembered other faces, other innocents caught in the crossfire. He holstered his Colt, then slowly leaned the Winchester against a nearby rock, making sure she saw his empty hands. "All right, girl," he muttered, more to himself. "Let's see if we can't keep you alive till morning." He approached again, this time with a more determined stride, but still unthreatening. When he was a few feet away, she uttered a single word in a low, guttural tone he didn't recognize, her eyes still locked on his. It sounded like a plea, or a curse. He crouched down, keeping his gaze steady, trying to project a calm he didn't entirely feel. He reached out slowly, palm up, towards her injured arm. She recoiled, but the movement was weaker this time. Exhaustion and pain were taking their toll. He had to act fast. He glanced at the sky. Dark clouds were gathering on the western horizon, promising a storm. That settled it. They'd need shelter, and soon. The first fat raindrop splattered against the sandstone as Jed gently, but firmly, took her arm. She tensed, a small, wounded bird in his grasp, but lacked the strength to pull away. He examined the gash. It was deep, crudely bound with a strip of what looked like her own dress, already soaked through. It needed cleaning, stitching even, but he didn't have the supplies for that here. For now, stemming the bleeding and preventing further infection was paramount. He eased her away from the rock, supporting her weight. She was light, almost frail, but there was a wiry strength in her he could feel. He led her towards Bess, who snorted nervously at the scent of blood and the approaching storm. The girl looked at the horse with wide, apprehensive eyes. He rummaged in his saddlebags, pulling out his canteen and the small oilskin pouch containing his medical supplies. He poured some water onto a relatively clean kerchief and gently began to clean the wound. She hissed in pain, biting her lip, but didn't cry out. Her stoicism surprised him. He worked quickly, applying a salve that stung but would help ward off the worst of the corruption, then binding it with a fresh linen bandage. Her breathing was shallow, rapid. The sky opened then, a sudden deluge that plastered his clothes to his skin in seconds. Lightning split the heavens, followed by a deafening clap of thunder. Bess reared slightly, and the girl stumbled, her eyes darting around for escape. Cave, Jed shouted over the roar of the storm, pointing towards a dark slash in the rock face he'd spotted earlier. Shelter! He didn't know if she understood the word, but the imperative gesture was clear. He half led, half carried her towards it, battling the wind and rain. The cave was little more than a deep overhang, but it offered protection from the worst of the downpour. Inside, it was damp and smelled of wet earth and something musky, animal. He settled her against the driest part of the rock wall, then went back out to retrieve Bess, leading the nervous mare as close to the entrance as possible. When he returned, the girl was watching him, her dark hair plastered to her face, shivering. He built a small fire just inside the cave mouth, the smoke thankfully drawn outwards by the wind. The flickering light cast dancing shadows on the walls, pushing back the oppressive gloom. He offered her his jerky, she refused it, her gaze still wary, but the fear was slowly being replaced by a watchful exhaustion. He sat across the small fire from her, the silence broken only by the storm's fury and the crackle of flames. He was stuck with her, at least for now. The storm raged through the night, a symphony of wind and thunder that kept sleep at bay. Jed dozed fitfully, one ear always attuned to the girl's breathing and the sounds outside the cave. Sometime before dawn, the rain softened to a drizzle, then stopped. A cold, damp chill permeated their shelter. He stirred the fire, adding a few more pieces of scavenged wood. As the meager light of morning crept into the cave, he saw the girl was awake, watching him. Her fever seemed to have lessened slightly, but she was still weak. He offered her water from his canteen, and this time, she accepted, her small hands cupping the metal, her eyes briefly meeting his before flicking away. He was surprised when, after drinking, she rose unsteadily and moved to the cave entrance. She scanned the damp earth, then, with a sharp flint she produced from a small pouch at her waist he hadn't noticed before, began to dig at the base of a harder-looking shrub. She unearthed a few pale, knobby roots, examining them critically before nodding to herself. She brought them back to the fire, expertly scraping off the dirt and placing them near the coals to roast. Jed watched, impressed. She knew this land, knew its secrets. Even injured and afraid, her survival instincts were sharp. He had been so focused on her vulnerability that he'd underestimated her resourcefulness. As the roots cooked, emitting a slightly sweet, earthy aroma. A new sound reached his ears, the soft crunch of footsteps on wet ground, too deliberate to be an animal. He grabbed his Winchester, motioning for the girl to stay quiet. She understood instantly, her eyes wide, pressing herself against the cave wall. Jed peered cautiously around the edge of the cave mouth. Two warriors, painted for war, their expressions grim, were examining the area where he'd found the girl. They carried bows and lances, their movements swift and predatory. Apache, like the dead ones. They were tracking her. One of them pointed towards the cave. Jed ducked back, his mind racing. He was one man, and they were two, possibly more nearby. A direct confrontation was foolish. He looked at the girl. Her face was pale, but her eyes held a spark of defiance. She pointed to a narrow fissure at the back of the cave, almost hidden by shadow, then to herself, then to the entrance. She was suggesting a diversion. It was risky, but it might be their only chance. He nodded. The warriors approached the cave entrance cautiously. Jed could hear their low murmurs, the scrape of their moccasins on stone. He held his breath, Winchester ready. The girl, a pony as he would later learn her name meant butterfly to her people, moved with surprising swiftness for someone so recently injured. She slipped into the narrow fissure at the back of the cave, a space barely wide enough for her slight frame. Jed prayed it led somewhere, anywhere but a dead end. One of the warriors, braver or perhaps more foolish than his companion, stepped into the cave mouth, spear held ready, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. Jed waited until he was fully committed, then brought the butt of his Winchester down hard on the man's exposed head. The warrior crumpled without a sound. The second warrior, hearing the thud, shouted an alarm and charged in. Jed didn't have time to aim. He fired from the hip. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space, the bullet striking the rock wall near the warrior's head, showering him with stone fragments. The warrior yelped, momentarily blinded and disoriented, and Jed used the opening to lunge, tackling him to the ground. A brutal, close-quarters struggle ensued. The warrior was strong, wiry, desperation giving him an edge. He clawed at Jed's face, trying to bring a wicked-looking knife into play. Jed managed to pin the man's knife arm, delivering a series of sharp blows to his ribs. Just as the warrior's grip began to weaken, a pony reappeared from the fissure, a sizable rock in her hand. She brought it down with focused intensity on the warrior's temple. He went limp. Jed rolled off, panting, adrenaline thrumming through him. He looked at a pony. Her chest was heaving, her dark eyes flashing. They had survived, together. He quickly bound the two unconscious warriors, using their own rawhide ties. There was no time to question them, even if they could understand each other. More would be coming. "We need to go," he said, urgency in his tone, grabbing his rifle. He looked at a pony. "Tracks. They follow you," he pointed to the ground outside, then to her. She nodded, her expression grim. She seemed to understand. She then spoke, a few soft words in her tongue, her hand gesturing towards the east, then making a motion of many. He pieced it together. The warriors were from her tribe. And there were more of them. Why were her own people hunting her? They moved quickly, Jed pushing the pace, a pony surprisingly keeping up despite her injury. The rising sun did little to warm the damp air. Jed scanned their back trail constantly. The Apache were skilled trackers, they wouldn't be fooled for long. He needed to put distance between them and their pursuers, find a place where they could make a stand or lose them entirely. A pony, despite her silence, proved an invaluable asset. She pointed out hidden game trails that cut through the dense chaparral, shortcuts Jed would never have found. She identified edible berries and sources of clean water he'd have overlooked. Her knowledge of the terrain was intimate, instinctual. As they paused for a brief rest in the meager shade of a rocky outcrop, Jed tried again to communicate. He pointed to himself. Then he pointed to her, an expectant look on his face. She hesitated, then whispered, a ponied butterfly. It suited her, he thought, that mix of fragility and elusive grace. He then made a questioning gesture, pointing back the way they came, then at her, his expression conveying his query, why? Aponi's face clouded. She looked down, tracing patterns in the dust with a slender finger. Then, slowly, using a combination of gestures and the few English words she seemed to have picked up from traders or perhaps a mission school, she began to paint a fragmented picture. She spoke of Chaitan, a name she uttered with a mixture of fear and anger. He was a war leader, powerful, respected, but also rigid. A zealot for the old ways, intolerant of any deviation. She gestured to her arm, then made a sign of disagreement, of defiance. It seemed she had broken some tribal law, or perhaps challenged Chaitan's authority directly. Her punishment was to be exile, or death. The warriors they'd encountered weren't just hunting an enemy, they were enforcing a decree. Jed listened, his brow furrowed. He'd seen men like Chaitan before, in all cultures, men who twisted tradition into a weapon, who valued dogma over mercy. His initial reluctance to get involved was fading, replaced by a grim sort of understanding. Aponi wasn't just a stray he'd stumbled upon, she was a refugee, fleeing a tyrant from her own kin. His path, it seemed, was now intertwined with hers, whether he liked it or not. The thought of facing down a determined Apache war party wasn't appealing, but the thought of abandoning Aponi to them was even less so. He was in this now. Their journey became a grueling test of endurance. Chaitan's warriors were relentless, their pursuit a constant shadow. Jed and Aponi moved mostly at night, resting during the hottest parts of the day in whatever cover they could find. Jed's cavalry training helped them cover ground efficiently, but it was Aponi's innate sense of the land that kept them one step ahead. She found water in unlikely places, a seep in a rock crevice, moisture-laden roots that quenched their thirst. She knew which plants could be eaten and which were poison, which insects signaled danger and which were harmless. Once, Jed, near delirious from heat and exhaustion, almost stumbled into a nest of desert vipers. Aponi's sharp cry, a sound like a hawk's warning, stopped him just in time. He owed her his life, he realized, as much as she owed him hers. The cultural divide remained, a chasm sometimes bridged by necessity, sometimes by a shared, wry glance at their predicament. He taught her the English words for water, danger, horse. She, in turn, taught him the Apache words for friend, enemy, and listened. The attempts at communication were often clumsy, frustrating, yet they slowly wove a fragile thread of understanding between them. One evening, as they shared a meager meal of roasted rabbit Jed had managed to snare, Aponi pointed to a faded scar on his forearm, a relic from a long-ago skirmish. Her dark eyes were questioning. Jed hesitated. He rarely spoke of his past, the memory still too raw, too heavy. But looking at Aponi, at her quiet resilience in the face of her own ordeal, he felt a crack in the wall he'd built around himself. Cavalry, he said, his voice low. Long time ago he paused, the firelight flickering on his weathered face. There was a village, peaceful. We were supposed to protect them. His voice grew thick with a remembered pain. We were too late. Or not strong enough. Or maybe some of us didn't care enough. He didn't specify who we or them were, the details felt less important than the crushing weight of failure. Lost a lot of good men. Lost, Moors. He trailed off, the unspoken words hanging in the cool night air. Aponi listened silently, her gaze unwavering. When he finished, she reached out, her small hand gently touching the scar. She said nothing, but her touch, her quiet presence, conveyed a depth of understanding that transcended words. It was a shared moment of vulnerability, a deepening of the bond forged in shared peril. He realized then that protecting Aponi wasn't just about her survival, it was about his own redemption, a chance to finally do something right. Days blurred into a relentless cycle of flight and evasion. Chaitan was proving to be a cunning adversary, anticipating their moves, forcing them into increasingly desperate situations. One afternoon, as they navigated a narrow canyon, the trap was sprung. Rocks cascaded down from the canyon rim, blocking their path ahead. Behind them, appearing as if from the very stones, stood Chaitan and a dozen of his warriors, bows drawn, lances glinting in the harsh sunlight. Chaitan was taller than the others, his face a mask of grim authority, eagle feathers adorning his black hair. He stepped forward, his eyes fixed on a pony. A pony, his voice was deep, resonant, carrying clearly in the confines of the canyon. He spoke in their native tongue, but his intent was clear even to Jed. "You have defied the spirits. You have shamed our people. Return, and face the judgment of the council. Your disobedience brings misfortune upon us all." The pony stood her ground, though Jed could see the tremor in her hands. He moved slightly, to stand beside her, his Winchester held ready but not aimed. Chayton's gaze flickered to Jed, dismissing him as an irrelevance. "This does not concern the white man," Chayton declared. "Leave her, and you may go unharmed." Jed didn't understand the words, but the offer was plain. A way out. His pragmatic side screamed at him to take it. He was outmanned, outgunned in a sense, and this wasn't his fight. But then he looked at a pony. Her fear was still there, but beneath it, a new strength was kindling, a defiant spark in her eyes. She turned to Chayton, and for the first time, Jed heard her voice ring out, clear and strong, no longer the timid whisper of a frightened girl. She spoke rapidly in her own language, her words sharp, accusatory. Jed couldn't understand the specifics, but the tone was unmistakable. She was not begging for mercy, she was challenging Chayton, defending her actions. Jed saw a flicker of surprise, then rage, in Chayton's eyes. He had expected a contrite fugitive, not this resolute young woman. A pony finished speaking, her chin held high. The silence that followed was heavy, charged. Chayton raised his hand, a signal for his warriors to knock their arrows. The choice was clear. Jed looked at a pony, then at Chayton. He thought of his past failures, the faces of those he couldn't save. He would not fail again. He would not run. He met Chayton's gaze, his own resolve hardening. "She's not going with you," Jed said, his voice calm but firm, his thumb easing back the hammer of the Winchester. The canyon exploded into chaos. Arrows hissed through the air, thudding into the rock around them. Jed returned fire, his shots carefully aimed, not to kill, but to disrupt, to create openings. He yelled for a pony to take cover, but she was already moving, darting behind a cluster of boulders, her earlier injury seemingly forgotten in the heat of the moment. Chayton's warriors advanced, using the terrain to their advantage, their movements fluid and practiced. Jed knew he couldn't hold them off for long. This was their land, their way of fighting. He fired again, forcing two warriors to duck back, then reloaded, his hands moving with mechanical efficiency. A pony, to his surprise, began to hurl rocks with surprising accuracy from her position, her sharp cries distracting the advancing warriors, drawing their attention. She wasn't just hiding, she was fighting, her knowledge of the canyon now a weapon. One warrior, attempting to flank Jed, slipped on a loose scree slope a pony seemed to have anticipated, giving Jed a clear shot that sent the man sprawling, his bow clattering away. The fight was desperate, brutal. Jed took a glancing blow from a thrown tomahawk on his shoulder, the impact staggering him. Pain lanced through him, hot and sharp. He gritted his teeth, firing back, dropping the warrior who'd thrown it. Chayton, enraged, bellowed orders, urging his men forward. He seemed immune to the danger, his focus entirely on reclaiming a pony, on imposing his will. Jed saw a subtle shift in some of the warriors' eyes. Chayton's fanaticism, his willingness to risk their lives so recklessly for what was increasingly looking like a personal vendetta against a pony, was causing hesitation. This wasn't a battle for survival against an outside enemy. This was an internal conflict, and a pony's spirited defense, coupled with Jed's unexpected tenacity, was giving some of them pause. A pony suddenly cried out a warning in Apache. Jed didn't understand the word, but her urgent tone and pointed finger made him whirl. A warrior had circled around, emerging from a hidden crevice, spear raised for a killing blow. Jed had no time to bring his rifle around. He lunged sideways, the spearhead tearing through his sleeve, grazing his ribs. Before the warrior could recover, a pony was there, a length of heavy driftwood in her hands, swinging it with all her might against the warrior's legs, sending him tumbling. The tide, ever so slightly, was beginning to turn. The battle raged, a whirlwind of desperate action and sudden violence. Jed fought with the grim determination of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove to himself. He saw a pony not as a liability, but as a warrior in her own right, her courage a beacon in the chaos. She used the canyon's echoes to her advantage, her calls disorienting Chaitan's men, making their numbers seem less overwhelming. She dislodged a small avalanche of pebbles and dirt, temporarily blinding a group of archers. Chaitan, seeing his control slipping, his warriors faltering, let out a roar of pure fury and charged directly at Jed, a long knife gleaming in his hand. Jed met the charge, parrying the knife thrust with his rifle barrel, the clash of steel ringing out. They grappled, Chaitan's strength fueled by fanatical rage, Jed's by a weary resolve. They crashed against the canyon wall, dust and grit filling the air. Jed felt Chaitan's fingers clawing for his eyes, the man's hot breath on his face. With a desperate surge of strength, Jed twisted, using Chaitan's momentum against him, and slammed the war leader hard against the unforgiving rock. Chaitan grunted, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Jed brought his knee up sharply into Chaitan's groin, then followed with an elbow to the jaw. Chaitan staggered back, dazed. Before he could recover, a pony was there. She didn't strike him. Instead, she spoke, her voice clear and carrying, addressing not Chaitan, but his remaining warriors. She spoke of traditions twisted, of honor betrayed by one man's hunger for power, of a path that led only to more division and sorrow. Her words, passionate and heartfelt, seemed to strike a chord. Several warriors lowered their weapons, their expressions troubled, conflicted. Chaitan, seeing his authority crumbling, made one last, desperate lunge at a pony. Jed intercepted him, a powerful right cross sending the war leader sprawling into the dust, his knife skittering away. Two of Chaitan's own warriors, their faces grim, stepped forward and seized their fallen leader, binding his hands. The fight was over. Silence descended on the canyon, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors. A pony stood tall, no longer a fugitive, but a voice of reason, of a different future. Jed leaned against the rock wall, the adrenaline ebbing away, leaving him bone-weary but with a sense of quiet triumph. In the aftermath, a tense parley took place. With Chaitan subdued, the remaining warriors listened as a pony spoke. She explained her defiance was not against their people or their true traditions, but against Chaitan's tyrannical interpretation of them, his attempt to silence dissent through fear. She revealed he had accused her falsely, twisting an accident involving a sacred ceremonial object into an act of deliberate desecration, all because she had questioned his increasingly aggressive stance towards peaceful neighboring tribes and even settlers. Some of the warriors, it turned out, had harbored their own doubts about Chaitan's leadership but had been too afraid to voice them. A pony's courage, and Jed's unlikely intervention, had given them the opening they needed. The warriors, after much deliberation, decided Chaitan would be taken back to face the full council, not as a hero, but as one who had brought shame and division. They offered a pony safe passage back to their village, assuring her she would be heard fairly. She looked at Jed, a complex mix of gratitude and uncertainty in her eyes. Her ordeal was over, her name would likely be cleared, but something had irrevocably changed within her. Jed knew that feeling. He nursed his wounds, the pain a dull ache compared to the lightness he felt in his spirit. He had faced down his past demons in that canyon, not by violence alone, but by choosing to stand for someone else, by refusing to let despair win. As the warriors prepared to depart with their captive, one of them, an older man with kind eyes, approached Jed. He offered Jed a water skin and a piece of dried meat, a gesture of respect. He spoke a few words in his native tongue, which a pony translated. He says you fought with honor, for one who is not of our people. He says the spirits must look kindly on you. Jed merely nodded, a lump in his throat. A pony then had to make her choice. To return to the familiar, to the life she knew, or to step into the unknown. The path back to her village was now open, but the world beyond, the world Jed represented in his own way, also beckoned. She had seen cruelty within her own culture and unexpected kindness from an outsider. The lines were no longer so clearly drawn. Her life had been irrevocably altered, not just by her persecution, but by the unlikely cowboy who had, against all odds, become her protector and, in some unspoken way, her friend. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape as Aponi made her decision. She would go with the warriors, face the council, and speak her truth. But she would not be the same girl who had fled in terror. She had found her voice, her strength. Before she left, she approached Jed. He stood by Bess, his gear packed, ready to resume his own solitary journey, though it felt different now, less aimless. Aponi held out her hand. In her palm lay the smooth, grey stone she had clutched in the cave, her only weapon when he'd first found her. She pressed it into his hand. "For courage," she said, her English still hesitant but clear. And, friend, Jed closed his fingers around the stone. It was cool, solid, a tangible reminder of everything they had endured. "Aponi," he said, the name feeling natural on his tongue. "You have courage enough for 10," he managed a rare, small smile. "Stay safe," she nodded, her dark eyes luminous in the fading light. "You too, Jed Stone." She turned and walked towards the waiting warriors, her back straight, her head held high. She didn't look back. Jed watched until she disappeared over the rise, a small, resilient figure swallowed by the vastness of the land. He mounted Bess, the weight of the stone in his pocket a comforting presence. The steer was long forgotten. It didn't matter anymore. He had found something far more valuable. He turned Bess not towards Henderson's ranch, but towards the open plains, towards a horizon that seemed less bleak, less empty than before. The burden of his past hadn't vanished, but it no longer defined him. He had faced death and despair and had chosen life and hope, not just for Aponi, but for himself. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Jedediah Stone felt a sense of peace, a quiet purpose. The Native American girl he had expected to be a brief, tragic encounter had indeed changed his life forever, not by anything she had consciously done, but by simply being, by surviving, and by allowing him to see a path beyond his own weariness. He rode on, the setting sun painting the sky in colors of promise.